Hello, IPL community, and we have a very special guest for you right now. It is Dr. Bill Saunders. Welcome, Dr. Bill.
Good morning.
I get very excited about Dr. Bill coming in to chat with us today because I am delighted to be your publisher for your amazing book, What Happened. Can we hold it up there so that the viewers can see? Just on this camera here. There we go. What happened, what mental health is all about. And by goodness is this book. It's made an impact. It's created amazing conversations. And if you read this book, I swear it will change the way you think. Honestly, it really is. So can you share a little bit about yourself and how you ended up in this place where you are now?
Sure. Look, I was a clinical psychologist. I did a degree in psychology many years ago, and then ended up at Glasgow University doing a master's in clinical psychology. And I then quite accidentally became an academic. Somebody invited me to come and teach at the University of Glasgow, and then I went from there to the University of Paisley, and then somebody phoned me up and said, "Do you want a job at Curtin?"
Yes.
So I spent 20 years being an academic, teaching about mental health, psychotherapy, and what works. But I then suddenly realised I was talking about it, I wasn't actually doing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I had one of those moments that I think happen to people when you're in your 40s where you suddenly realise, I'm never going to become an airline pilot or a professional soccer player. I'm actually a psychologist. And I suddenly thought, well, if I'm going to be a psychologist, I really ought to do it rather than just talk about it. So I went off and ran a drug agency in Britain. And then when I came back here, a couple of friends said to me, do you want to buy a psychiatric hospital? It's not a sort of
as you do, you know, like I was like, that's kind of came left centre.
That's the sort of conversation we have every day. So over a number of glasses of red, we all decided it was a jolly good idea, as you do.
Yeah.
That led to a decade of fascinating work in running what was an old, decrepit psychiatric facility and turning it into a boutique, modern, psychotherapy-based hospital. And then eventually somebody came along, a big shark came along and ate us up. But the experience of working flat out in a mental health facility totally persuaded me that the medical model of mental health isn't really right. Mm-hmm. And psychiatry is confronted with a number of serious challenges, not the least that, although it perpetuates the idea that every mental illness has a biological basis, despite spending millions, billions of dollars trying to find the so-called biological causes of mental illness, today there are still none that are known. So that of the 260 or so-called mental illnesses in DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, the causes of mental illness are still, according to the psychiatrist, unknown. So the argument in this book is that is just nonsense. If you spend $20 billion and you can't find something, it's probably because it's not there.
You're looking in the wrong place.
You're looking in the wrong place. So that's not to dispute in any way that people don't get terribly distressed, they don't get depressed, anxious, or whatever. They certainly do. But the causes of that, is the argument in the book, it's not about their biology, but actually about what happened to them as kids. And I think it was it's no coincidence, actually, that as this book came out, some American woman called Oprah Winfrey launched a book in the same week as we did with the same title.
Isn't it profound? Like, that was not planned. We did not know that was happening.
No. I actually typed in what happened to see
where your
if
book
was getting any currency, and her book popped up.
Yes.
And I burst out laughing. And I think that's one of the things, that there is now a growing dissatisfaction with the medical model. And there's a number of implications from them not having any causes, the so-called causes of mental illnesses. There are no blood tests for any of the diagnoses. There are no hard endpoints. So every psychiatric diagnosis is nothing other than an opinion.
Yeah.
And that's the problem, because opinions differ. And some of the evidence in the book, when you actually take the same patient to 3 different psychiatrists, the chances are you're going to get at least 2 different diagnoses, possibly 3. And therein lies the problem. Every diagnosis in psychiatry is unstable, it's unreliable. And so there's no biological base, and yet they give you a diagnosis which they assume there's a biological base for, which they haven't found yet, and then they give you a pill which changes your biochemistry and parts of your brain where they think there might just be a cause for depression or anxiety or schizophrenia, but they haven't actually found it yet. So then you take pills which change the biochemistry of your brain, and the evidence is these drugs are the evidence is increasing that actually they're relatively ineffective. And most of the benefit that comes from taking a so-called antidepressant or a so-called antipsychotic is a placebo effect. And over the years, if you put people on long-term antidepressants or long-term antipsychotics, they do worse than samples who don't take them.
Wow. So what do we do, Dr. Bill? What's the solution?
We have lots of conversations. We start a revolution where we say to psychiatry, sorry, we're not playing the game the way you want to play it. And we need to totally avoid diagnosis. We need to sit down with people. We need to shift from an essentially medical hospitalized model. I mean, in my view, you could do immense good for mental health by, instead of having everybody turn up at ED, wait for 5, 6, 7 hours to be seen by a psychiatric registrar who, to be honest, doesn't really know enough, and then to be given pills or get locked up for a while. You see, I would build things called something like the residence, which would be by every tertiary medical hospital, you would have a non-medical residence with about 10 beds, and you could take patients from accident and emergency, from ED, and literally highly distressed people. Overwhelmingly, people turn up at ED very distressed because of relational issues, and they're suicidal because their worlds have come to an end. So basically, they don't need a hospital bed. They don't need a hugely expensive hospital bed. They need somewhere to go where they can sit calmly and tell their story and be listened to. So you could save a lot of money and offer a better service by demedicalizing the system.
Every time I speak to you, my brain just goes, wow. And I'm very passionate about mental health, as I know the IPL community is as well. And to think that just by facing the issues, instead of avoiding them, instead of putting a sticky plaster over them, instead of medicating them, that you do have to put in the hard work, but it's worth it because you get the results. You get to break down and find a solution, find the core of the problem.
The core of the problem is not some aberrant biology. The core of the problem is what happened to you as a kid. Look, I mean...
external influences.
Yeah, and there's another problem for psychiatry, which is the Human Genome Project, which actually is looking at, at the biological, the genetic causes, if you like, of madness, except they can't find it. So even a disorder like schizophrenia, the Human Genome Project is saying, look, there's no genetic basis to these disorders. And that is causing psychiatry a lot of problems. And all they do, they just keep looking more.
Yeah.
So they get further and further and further down and more reductionist. And they still haven't found the genetic basis of a disorder like schizophrenia. And there's really now huge questions as to whether schizophrenia as an entity actually exists. And there's a beautiful study which is quoted in the book, which is the 1970 study. 1970 study. The issue is they got American psychiatrists, Canadian psychiatrists, and British psychiatrists to diagnose a case, and they couldn't agree. And in one case, half of the Americans thought they had schizophrenia. A third of the Canadian psychiatrists thought case F had schizophrenia, but only 2% of the British psychiatrists thought the patient had schizophrenia. Now, if you cannot reliably diagnose schizophrenia, the so-called major mental illness, then you've got a real problem. But what we increasingly know is that psychosis, seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't there, believing things that aren't true, are much more prevalent in people who've had very difficult childhood.
And schizophrenia is a very serious thing, you know, to speak on, because it is such an impact not only on the person but everyone around them. And it's I want to just go into your dedication, because I think it's a really good lead up from what you were just talking about. Because when you read this dedication at your book launch, which was an amazing book launch, it was amazing. It was so good. And it was just perfect. It was a perfect time. Everything happened. But when Dr. Bill read this, it just hit everyone very hard. So brace yourself, Ali.
This is a totally true story. It's one of those really quirky things.
Yeah.
That finished. On the day I finished writing this book, the front doorbell chimed. I opened the door. There was a gentleman standing there. "My name is John and I have a disability, and could I clean your windows? But don't hire the disability, hire the window cleaner." So I did. As he worked, I asked him about his disability. "I'm a schizophrenic and I take a drug called Risperidol. I take 7.5 milligrams every day. Do you know about that drug?" "Yes," I said, "I do." "How do you find it?" "Well, it makes me fat, but sort of stops the voices." "What do you do?" "I'm a clinical psychologist." "It's funny, isn't it," he said, "that nobody knows what causes mental illness." I said, "I do." He looked at me astonished. I said, "What happened to you?" He replied, "When I was 6, my mum ran away from my violent father. For the next 6 years, I was locked in my bedroom. My dad never let me out the house for 6 years. Is that what caused my schizophrenia?" I said, "Yes, we know that really nasty childhoods like yours cause schizophrenia." He said, "Thank you. I never knew that." This book is dedicated to improving the understanding of the impact of childhood trauma upon psychological functioning, and thereby, hopefully, we will improve the services we offer people with so-called mental illnesses.
It's amazing, and the book is amazing, where you share it such light-hearted way, because you're such a. We always have humorous conversations, even though we're talking about a serious subject. But it's amazing how you articulate and share the stories of. Obviously, everyone is anonymous in the book, but you share the stories of these people to just demonstrate and get us readers thinking about maybe people in our lives or maybe ourselves, where we can learn from others' experiences to think deeper.
Yeah, look, I mean, one of the lovely things that ended up working in the psychiatric hospital I do was that we worked very intensively with lots of psychotherapy for our clients. And it was funny that yesterday 2 methamphetamine addicts at the time, right, who came through our hospital, who did lots of groups, we celebrated their 6 years of being straight by all going for a helicopter ride.
Oh, amazing.
So we all high together.
Yes, going high, literally, hey?
Love it.
When you look, I mean, there's a tragic tale in the book, actually, about one of my colleagues, this sounds bad, we had a bet about how many of our female clients with drug problems actually had been sexually abused. And my colleague, a GP, but a very dedicated and hard-working and very good with addiction, he said, it's got to be 50, 60%. And I said, no, I think it's a tad higher. I said 75. So he said, I'll bet you a bottle of red. So I went back through 50 of our last female patients, and the percentage of our female patients with drug problems who've been sexually abused was 100%.
100%.
I was going to guess between 95 to 100, and that was a guess. So that's incredible, because that's not.
It's a coping mechanism, isn't it? Though people turn to it to numb.
People get very hot about alcohol and drug use, and they make it into a big issue. So the person who's using substances excessively, what they're doing, they're using substances to soothe themselves. So what you have to do, you sort of get them sober, and then you have to see beyond the substance and then deal with the underlying issues. So actually, heavy drug use, heavy alcohol use, it's a problem, but it's not the problem. Mm-hmm. The problem is what happened to you.
Yeah. And how, like, that's something that you have to navigate pretty, you'd have to navigate to get someone off the drugs and get someone off the alcohol. They're obviously in a tender spot to then confront maybe what happened to them. If that's...
I have a straightforward policy, which is there's a number of psychological techniques you can use, some of which are described in the book. But it's relatively straightforward to measure somebody's motivation and see where they are about stopping. Mm-hmm. And I have 3 questions which I ask. So I'll say to a client with an alcohol and drug problem, I say, let's take somebody with an alcohol problem. I'll say to him, for you personally, how much is your alcohol use a problem for you? Score it out of 10. And so, and you get a whole range of answers. But usually when I'm seeing clients, by the time they get to me, I get 8, 9 or 10, it's a problem for them. And that's important. Mm-hmm. For them, it's a problem. But that's a logical question. Then you say, how much are you concerned about your alcohol use? So that's an emotional question. And usually that scores a bit higher. So they'll say, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10. So here you've got somebody who's 8, 9 out of 10 know they have a problem. 9 out of 10, they're concerned about it. And then you hit them with the how much do you desire to stop drinking for 90 days question. And that score ranges from 0 to 10. Yeah. So I can remember a delightful lawyer I was seeing who turned in 10 out of 10 it was a problem for him, 10 out of 10 he was concerned about it, 0 out of 10 he liked the stick. Now, when it's like that, there's nothing you can do. So I said to him, okay, bugger off, I'll see you in 3 months. And he said, no, I've got to keep coming to see you. I said, no, you're only coming to see me to get other people off your back, right? Mm-hmm. That's not going to wash, right? You know you've got a problem. You know you're concerned about it. You're not choosing to stop. And we have to be very careful here about the whole notion of addiction. People who use substances exceptionally love playing the, but I'm addicted card, Doc. I can't stop, Doc. Why can't you stop? Because I'm addicted. How do you know addicted? Because I can't stop. Why can't you stop? Because I'm addicted. I go, we're just going round in circles here. And of course, the truth of the matter is, it is a decision. I had cancer once. I couldn't do anything about it, right? I had it. I didn't like it. 10 out of 10, it was a problem. 10 out of 10, I was concerned about it. I had no personal agency to get rid of it. In the end, I had to go and see a man with a knife and get rid of it. Now, the interesting thing about that is that's the card that people with drug problems want to play. They want to go, I can't, there's nothing I can do. Bollocks. So what you have to say to them is, you got a choice. You can choose to stop or you can choose to continue. But both decisions are choices and both of those choices are hard. Mm-hmm. So basically I give people the challenge of saying to them, look, what do you choose to do? Now some people will choose to drink and continue to choose to drink, and I respect that choice. But there's no way out. You can't get out of a drink problem by drinking. The only way you can get out of a drink problem is by stopping. Yeah. And most people get that. And I then challenge them to get straight for 90 days. 90 days, it's really interesting that if you set anyone a task, so if people make New Year's resolutions about losing weight, saving money, studying more, working less, we know that by the time you get to 6 weeks, most of them are still doing it. About 80% of them are still doing it. Excellent. But by the time you get to 90 days, only 20% of them are doing it. Now, that's got nothing to do with alcohol and drugs. That's about human beings making decisions. So there's no such thing in alcohol and drug use, a relapse. Oh, he's had a relapse. No, it's not a relapse. He or she have just changed their mind. Yeah. Right? And so I use a very pragmatic, what are you going to choose to do? Now, the interesting thing, when you get people to about 90 days, somewhere round about there, or even in that process, so getting them from 40 days to 90 days, that's relapse central, that's change your mind central. So getting them through there, and that's in that period, you start talking to them about what happened. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, you hear stories of neglect. And the trouble with neglect, it often leads to abuse. And of course, you can have neglect and abuse. Now, there's a much debate in the field about whether children being neglected, i.e. not getting enough of the right stuff, is worse or less worse than actually being abused. So that means being physically abused, sexually abused, or emotionally abused. My experience over the years, I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind from believing that it was the sexual abuse or the emotional abuse that was, or the physical abuse that was worse. I think neglect, right, not getting enough of the right stuff, is really what leads to a whole range of issues for adults. And because it's the absence of something, it's often difficult to quantify, and it's often difficult for people to say, my childhood was neglectful, because it was their childhood, so they think it's normal. And I think that's the problem. They know that being sexually abused, being physically abused or emotionally abused is wrong. But neglect is just the absence. And one patient who I quote in the book summed it up beautifully. She said it was the dark, grey days of neglect that drove me crazy. The sexual abuse, not so much. And I think a lot of the patients, I mean, it is so funny, because as a psychologist, you'll be sitting there, a new patient will come and sit down and say, you say, what brings you to see a psychologist? And they will say, oh, doc, I'm depressed, or I'm this, or I'm that. And then you say, tell me about your childhood. And they'll go, oh, my childhood was fine. After 3 or 4 sessions, my childhood was fine has been changed into my childhood was shit. And I think you have to appreciate that and come to terms with that, come to terms with what didn't happen for you to actually make progress. And this comes out in all... what neglect does, it actually doesn't allow you to learn how to emotionally regulate. So the trouble with ongoing neglect is you do not know, when you get distressed, you do not know how to manage it. And what will happen is that most people who have been neglected, the barometer emotion, which is the giveaway from somebody's childhood, is anger. Right? So here's a question for anyone listening,
Yes.
which is, how quickly do you go from 0 to 0? So how many, sorry, terrible question. How quickly do you go from 0 to 100 when it comes to anger? And how long does your dysregulation, once you get really angry, how long does it last? And the quicker you get angry or rageful, and the longer it lasts, the more your childhood was poor.
Ooh, that's
Wow.
interesting. Eh? Couldn't you just listen to Dr. Bill all day?
All day, every day.
There is one thing I want you to share, because this was fascinating, and you shared it at the launch, about the young man whose mum wouldn't let him have a magazine. Do you remember? She made him save his money. Just, it was an amazing insight, just quickly.
Yes, that was a very interesting depressed man who was in his 50s. And to cut to the chase, what had happened was he had been told from very early on that his mother didn't think she could ever conceive. So when she conceived, she was so delighted that she put $10 a day in a tin for him, and then it went into the bank. And she said that this was because he was the apple of her eye. It was the apple of her eye, so he got $10 every day. When I saw him, he was living in his brother's derelict house. He had his deceased father's 25-year-old car, and he lived on handouts, really, from his mum. And every day was the same. And I suddenly it became apparent that he didn't own anything. Even the dog he had was his brother's.
It's his younger brother as well, was
reject dog. And so I actually became curious about how he was surviving. And he told me about the Apple in the Eye Fund. And one day I just said to him casually, and we were struggling, we weren't really getting anywhere. And he told me he didn't think psychotherapy was going to work. He tried it before. Mind you, he tried ECT, he tried pills, he tried everything. And so I said to him, how much is in the Apple of the Eye Fund? And so he went home to talk to his mum to find out. He didn't know. I mean, here's a 50-year-old man who doesn't know how much money is in his fund.
Gosh.
And
Brace yourself, Ollie.
Yes. And he came back the next week, and I just made a note, and I said to him, how much is in the Apple of the Eye Fund? And he said, $3.2 million. And we both went,
Gosh.
I said, well, I won't say what I said, because but you can imagine the sort of thing you would say when you hear that. And what had transpired, that when he was 6 or 7, he was the apple of his mum's eye. He had gone with his mum, he had gone into a news agency in Applecross, as it happened, and he had found a comic he liked. And he rushed back to his mum, all happy and 6 or 7 years old, and he said, Mum, this is a great comic. Can I have some of my Apple of your eye fund to buy this this comic? And his mother turned on him and said, you are a very bad little boy. Put that comic down immediately. Don't you know that money is the most precious thing? It's not to be squandered. That is just terrible. I am so disappointed in you. Put that thing down immediately. The trouble with comics is you'll buy one this week and next week you'll want another one. So put that down and never go to your room. I've never been so disappointed in you. He was totally shamed in front of all the customers in the shop and made to feel a very bad boy. Now, there's an interesting thing about shame. Guilt is when you've done wrong to others. Shame is when you know you are wrong. His mother's treatment of him made him, and clearly, here she is, over 40 years, she saves him $3.2 million and won't give it to him, right?
Torture.
And he thought his childhood was fine.
But his younger brother had all of he was allowed to.
Yes, his younger brother, who wasn't the apple of mum's eye, just came and go as he went. And
he was really successful
because he hadn't had the absolute weight
pressure
of being the apple of someone's eye.
Amazing story. You're going to have to get this book, guys. What Happened by Dr. Bill Saunders. And if you want a prelude to the book, just get that other woman's book. Get Oprah's book, What Happened, because her book is a really big compliment to your book. It talks about the childhood aspect.
Yes, look, it's totally complementary because what she does, she's worked with a psychiatrist who's into the neuroscience of brain development. And what he shows is that, the importance of the early years of life because they change your brain. Mm-hmm. So the book, Oprah Winfrey's book, is very much about childhood and what happens to your brain on the lack of development in your brain through neglect and abuse. Whereas my book actually talks about the adult survivors of poor childhood. So the two books actually sit quite nicely together. And what, of course, is very important is that in Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey's book, he actually writes, he says, the first 2 months of life are the most important of your life because of attachment. Because that's, you actually get born and that's when you learn to attach. So the safety and the security of the first 2 months are vital. And what his evidence shows, and what evidence from a big University of Liverpool study shows, is you are much more likely to become psychotic if in that first 2 months there are disruptions of your attachment. Mm-hmm. So we have an adoption process often where children are taken away from their mums. It's done at birth. Now, whether that is good policy is hugely debatable. Given the Bruce Perry evidence, what you would argue is if mum is deemed to be unfit to look after children, which is a huge call to say such a thing, but at times it is true, you might want to do these adoptions, given the evidence, you might want to do adoptions at 3 months, not no days at all. Yeah. And it was interesting, because just personally I had a colleague who was read the book and said, yeah, but my brother's got schizophrenia. And I went, yes. Tell me about your brother. And she goes, well, he was adopted. And I went, well, there you go. Yeah. He was adopted at birth. And I think and there's also evidence, of course, that what happens to you in utero matters. So women who were first attenders who were involved in 9/11, who actually saw the towers come down that day, who were pregnant, their children were much more anxious, hypervigilant, hyperstartleable. I don't know if that's a word, but they had hyperstartle at 5 years than a match sample of 50 women who hadn't been in Manhattan that day. Mm-hmm. So we know that, And you can just imagine.
Isn't it fascinating?
You just imagine if you got a mum and a dad who really want a child, and mum getting pregnant is just a delight, and the whole pregnancy just becomes fascinating. You know, I can remember my first daughter. I mean, it was absolutely fascinating watching the whole process. I mean, it was just amazing.
Yeah.
And that was a very joyful and very good period.
It's a love fuel thing when there's love there. Isn't that the good stuff you're talking about?
Good stuff. That's the right stuff.
It's a miracle. We're all witnessing a miracle.
I know. But just imagine if you're 16, you're a Roman Catholic girl who's accidentally got pregnant, and you've got all the opprobrium of being a sinner and all the rest of it, and you're put away, you're hidden away somewhere.
In a convent, I've seen it I've seen it happen.
And you know,
My grandmother.
every development of your body, every movement, every kick will be for you just horrible, right? I mean, it's just so dark. I mean, why we do this to girls who get pregnant, I do not know, but, you know, we have to have morality, yes. And the truth of that is that those children who then get adopted have not only had the absolute being severed from their mother, right, and whole new different smells and whatever, so the whole insecurity, they've also had the fact that while they were developing, you know, they were not wanted, and there was a huge sense, and I'm sure that
And there would have been a lot of fear.
there'd be a lot of fear,
Yeah.
anxiety, because mum would have been drenched in fear and anxiety.
Yeah.
Shame.
Isn't it?
Shame.
And shame. Isn't it amazing? Goodness me! Like the amount of facets of it all.
But what the evidence shows is that if you are unfortunate enough to end up in care and you end up in a foster home or in a group home, you are much more likely as an adult to develop paranoia. Think about it. Well, of course you would, because, you know, people are out to get you.
Trust issues, wouldn't there be?
Issues.
Yeah.
So, and if you're sexually abused as a child, you're much more likely to have hallucinations. So you're much more likely to see things that aren't there or believe things that aren't true.
Why is that?
No, that's a very good question.
Sorry, just like why would
That
that
is a very
be?
good question. Okay, let me have a moment of thought. Why would you... Look, it could even be a sort of dissociative thing, because if you get raped, you don't want to be present when
In your
you're
body,
raped.
yeah.
So people dissociate, which is legally quite tricky, because often they can remember the beginning of the rape and then they'll come round after the rape, but they don't actually remember much of the rape. So we dissociate. It actually keeps you safe. So dissociation, freezing is a safe thing.
Keeps your mind safe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look, the trick of this is if you're in a really anxiety-provoking situation, you can act out, i.e. fight, and yell and scream and flee, or you can act out or act in. So act-inners dissociate and disappear. And I suspect that is part of the process of having hallucinations, because you go into yourself.
Survival mode, isn't
Yes,
it?
it is survival. It is survival.
Oh my goodness! Wow, what a conversation, Ali. Hey,
And it's just
he's amazing,
it
isn't he?
touches every area of society though.
Oh, there's not one family that won't be touched.
All our attachments. Look, we know that about 60%, 60 to 55% of people growing up have lovely childhoods. They have a secure mum and dad. They grow up and they know that they are lovable.
Yeah.
That's the key. And they're also emotionally regulated. So when they get distressed, somebody soothed them. There's a very simple exercise I ask, which is to say to somebody, here you go, Ali, you can do this.
Yes, there we go.
For sure.
I want you to imagine that you're 8 years old again, okay? Think of the school you went to. Got it?
Yeah.
Now, I want to imagine that you had a shit day at school. You've been picked on, you've been bullied, you've been chastised unfairly, you had to read something out, you got it wrong, everybody laughed, and you burst into tears. You know, one of those 8-year-old days. And then at the end of the day, you go home, but you're still feeling distressed. You go home, you enter the house. What would you have done next?
Probably tell my mum about it.
And what would mum say?
She would be more soothing and actually nurturing. She'd actually tell me that you're okay, don't worry.
Excellent.
It happens to everybody.
Okay. You're one of the 60%. Right now, of my patients, overwhelmingly, they said, I've gone home, I'd have gone to my room, I would have kicked my brother, I would have eaten, I would have drunk something, and I'd have gone out playing. So they manage by distraction. You manage by talking. Now, what psychotherapy is all about is about getting people to manage their emotions through language by talking. And we connect by talking. And of course, what you did, you showed your vulnerability. Now, vulnerability is the key to intimacy and connection. Now, unfortunately, what most of my patients have, they think vulnerability is a weakness. Whereas the truth of the matter, of course, is that vulnerability is a strength. Mm-hmm. And that's what sometimes you have to do. I saw a new patient last week who'd had a shocking, physically brutal father, and trying to make contact with her in the therapy room was difficult. A, I'm male. B, I'm much older than she was. Yep. And C, her sense of, I must not be vulnerable. You cannot show weakness because Dad will get me. Mm-hmm. Right? So she was determined to be as tough as she could. But of course, that's just a carapace. It's just the skin. And underneath, she's a mess. Yep. So we will work very hard together to allow her to be vulnerable. Yeah. So she actually feels safe enough to become vulnerable.
Yeah, it is. It's a safe, like you had your safe haven. My kids just come home and have a tantrum, and then we do the talking. There's the emotional release version of that. Yeah. Oh my goodness. And Dr. Bill, you've just opened up a new office in Perth, haven't you? With your wife.
It's funny, COVID has a lot to blame. I think COVID is a very, the whole COVID thing is a very interesting sociological event, if you like, as well as a medical one. But after writing the book, I had 3 trips lined up and I was all set to go. Yeah. And of course, none of them happened. And then suddenly I was looking down the barrel of nothing. So I thought, I better get back to work. And one day has become 2, has become 3. Mm-hmm. And so my wife and another colleague, my wife's also a clinical psychologist, so we've opened up an office in West Perth, which is actually delightful. My wife spotted the building and it's really beautiful. So we have a very nice office to work out of. And because I'm doing it sort of part-time, it is, I'm having, I shouldn't say doing therapy is lots of fun, but actually it is.
Well, you have to focus on the positive energy around it and the scenario that you've created for yourself. It's amazing.
And, it's really different from being involved in running a hospital. Yeah. The client load is different. The management of patients is different, and you don't have to try and live with one hand tied behind your back because you're trying to deal with a psychiatric problem, which just doesn't work. And I think that's what the value of the 10 years working in the hospital we had was actually to prove to me once and for all that the psychiatric model is untenable. Mm-hmm. It's, the diagnoses don't matter, their treatments don't work, and, really, it's just a revolving door.
That's it. And this book is stirring the pot. Let's be honest. When we came together to write this book, we were like, okay, this is going to shake, have a few conversations that need to happen, really.
What has been most interesting, probably, has been the lack of reaction.
Mm-hmm. More embracing.
Nice words. Yeah. I haven't had a hostile anything come my way.
We did think that, didn't we? I
did think that it would stir the pot. It might just be preaching to the converted. That may be what's happened, is that everyone's gone, oh, yes. But what was lovely was a couple of old colleagues from Britain picked it up. And, they were very... they teased me about my early beginnings as a psychologist. How could I end up here? But apart from those little personal jibes, it's very reassuring that people who've made their way very successfully in their fields have actually gone, well done, Bill. So I think it's interesting about the lack of... but there may well be, of course, 2 camps. This is what may be happening. There may be the trauma-informed camp and the medical camp, and maybe, they're not speaking to each other at all. And I think as psychiatry comes up, it's like all of us. When we come under attack, we tend to defend ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably what psychiatry is doing. It's pretending that everything is still all right. But what is interesting, I read a review of the launching of DSM-5, which was the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and it's very clear that even when that came out in 2015, or 14, there was a real sense that, the way they do diagnosis just doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And the lack of biological markers, the lack of anything to confirm a diagnosis. I mean, psychiatry is the only branch of medicine where everything is based on opinion. I mean, you really wouldn't want it, would you? I've got a lump in my breast. What do you think, doc? Oh, I think you've got cancer. I'll cut it off. Well, no, you don't really want that. You want to have an MRI. You want to have imaging. You want to have a biopsy. Now, just think that
you want confirmation, don't you?
You want confirmation. You want independent third-party confirmation. And in psychiatry, there's none. So people come to me and they say, I mean, I've got a patient last week who said to me, oh, yeah, no, I've got bipolar. And I said...
Is that Dr. Google?
No.
They're actually diagnosed with it.
I've got bipolar. And I said, well, let's have a look at this. What he had was a terribly turbulent childhood where things went good, things went bad, things went good, things went bad, things went good, things went bad. So he's used to bouncing around all over the place. He was on 3 forms of mood stabilizers. Actually, there aren't any mood stabilizers. They're either antipsychotic drugs or they're anti-epilepsy drugs. So although psychiatrists do that, we have a mood stabilizer, no, they're just using other drugs to slow down your brain. And the idea that you can stabilize mood by running your car with the handbrake, I'm not sure. And where do you stabilize this mood? I mean, if it really does stabilize your mood and they're depressed, do you end up stabilized in depression? Oh no, we'll give you an antidepressant. But antidepressants aren't antidepressants, they're serenic drugs. So they make you serene. So you have a drug that makes you serene, and you then have drugs which seize up your brain, and there you are locked in some sort of emotional wasteland. And you can't block one emotion. So you can't just block I feel shit. You have to block I feel happy at the same time. Yep. So one of the debates I had with this patient, and I've only had 2 sessions, will be to get him to discuss with his psychiatrist about coming off all 3 of his mood stabilizing.
There'll be fear around that though, won't there?
Sorry?
Will there be fear from your patient about that?
Look, I'm sure there will, because he accepted it, but I just, to be honest, I gave him the literature about the antipsychotic he was on. I gave him the literature about the anti-epilepsy drug he was on, and I said, your choice. Look at the fact you need to have a discussion with your psychiatrist. Look, just on another story, I had a patient who I started seeing a year ago, and he was on a benzodiazepine long-term, which is really a no-no, because benzodiazepines are the worst drugs to come off of. They cause very rapid tolerance, and after that they don't work, so people up the dose, and then they have to withdraw, and the withdrawal effects from benzodiazepines are the worst.
Addiction.
Never mind heroin. Coming off benzos you actually shatter. So he's on a benzodiazepine. He'd been on them for 10 years.
Wow.
He was on an antidepressant. He'd been on it for 10 years and at a very high dose. And he was also on a mood stabilizer at a very high dose. A year later, he's on nothing. And I said to him, how's your world? And this was a week ago. And I said, how's your world in comparison to a year ago? And he said, emotionally, it's exactly the same. So he'd been taking all these toxic drugs for no gain whatsoever.
Isn't it shocking? Amazing.
And now he's beginning to move. He actually, for the first time for about 10 years, is actually finding some energy and traction and agency. Now, it might be another year before we actually get him back to work and all the rest of it. But he is no longer tethered to the spot.
Yes. That's it, tethered to the spot. There's actually going to be a gauge of moving forward instead of just standing in the same place for a lifetime. Can you imagine, 10 years? Oh, wow. There's so many stories that you can share, isn't there? There's just so many individual scenarios.
Yes.
And it is individual, isn't it?
Yes, because everyone's childhood is different.
So you can't just do a one-size-fits-all kind of solution.
No, but you can come at it from what happened to you rather than what's wrong with you.
Yes. And that's what that's the big message you want to put out there.
You see, I had a patient
Solution
the other night.
focused.
Yeah, I had a patient the other night who came in and said, I'm getting increasingly anxious. And I said to him, let's just look at that. Let's just consider what that's about. Let's consider that symptom of anxiety, rather than seeing it as wrong and something that needs to be treated and got rid of, let's see it as being right. Let's see your anxiety as being a right response. Given your childhood, this is a right response to your circumstances here and now. So as you say to me that over the last 3 months you've got more anxious, let's explore that. What has happened in the last 3 months that is causing this anxiety, and your anxiety is the right response. So where's the threat? What's happening? And what transpired after some exploring, you end up playing mind detectives. So the two of you work together and play mind detectives, and you work out, Now what happened was he'd had a highly critical father who found fault. He was never praised for getting things right. He was always told instantly when he had done something wrong. So he's got a strong mantra in him, built into him, about, I must not get things wrong. What had happened was he is a diesel mechanic apprentice, but he's a very good one. Of course he is, because he works very hard to not get things wrong. So he'd been given added responsibility. More and more responsibility was given to him. And what had happened was suddenly he was managing other people. He's still an apprentice. They shouldn't be doing it. The firm who were using him shouldn't be doing this. He's an apprentice. Yeah. But they were giving him, because he was such a good apprentice, they were giving him added authority. And they would get him to work with electricians and welders and things to fix big trucks. And suddenly he's under threat, because, of course, the threat is, I could get this wrong. Mm-hmm. And so his anxiety had gone up. So his anxiety was quite right, given his childhood. So what we've done, we've worked very hard with him, and I've actually got him, instead of saying I'm an idiot, I'm a fool, I'm useless, I've now got him saying, when he comes to a job, he just stands there and looks at the piece of equipment and says, I'm the man. I'm the man that's going to fix you, right? His anxiety, we'll see, it's going down.
Yeah.
Without any medical.
Because he's taking control and relinquishing the fear around it.
Well, he's also understanding why his anxiety wasn't wrong. So, you could have given him an anti-anxiety drug to dampen down his anxiety, but it wouldn't have dealt
the knowledge,
that he fears getting things wrong. And I'm actually encouraging him to make mistakes. And I keep on saying to him, I've always learnt more from my mistakes than I ever had from
myself. And I think people in life in general, because it's Mental Health Week, whenever we allow ourselves that grace of, the things that we learn the most is, if I face a challenge or if I make a mistake, I don't do it again because I learn from it. I stop to learn. And if you don't stop to learn, how are you supposed to grow?
It's also how you speak to yourself.
Yes.
Instead of going, I'm an idiot for doing that, you just say, oh, that's interesting, I got that wrong. And you're gentle. So, look, for me, all the mental health, so-called mental health disorders are really about your relationships with others and how you attach to others, but also, most importantly, the relationship you have with yourself. Mm-hmm. So if you like yourself, if you really think yourself you're okay, then anything you run into, you're going to manage. Whereas if you basically believe, because of what happened to you, that you are flawed, you are shamed, you are useless, not good enough, too much, too little, whatever, whenever you run into a problem, it's going to be much less likely that you're going to manage that problem well. Because
fascinating.
You're stressed.
Absolutely fascinating. We're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much, Dr. Bill. Where can people find you, or do you not want them to find you?
Yes, I probably don't really want people to find me, because I'm actually,
Are you referral based?
We're referral based, but people just phone up and find us. But
yes,
the difficulty is, as every psychologist is, we're all enormously busy.
Yes.
Because COVID is really interesting. People do not come along, hey doc, I've got a problem with COVID. They come along, I've got a problem here, I've got a problem there. And then suddenly you realise the backdrop is COVID, right? My father-in-law just had open heart surgery in England, and for my wife having to manage that, being here, and you can't go there. I mean, normally we'd have gone straight away. Mm-hmm. And that has it's made his open heart surgery much more difficult, because we can't do it, and the anxiety and not knowing, and and that's what COVID is problematic, is because it interferes with healthy relationships. It interferes with supportive relationships, and I know my father-in-law would have dealt much better if my wife had been holding his hand,
absolutely,
and had been present, and actually had the surgery in Oxford, so it would have been really lovely to spend some time in Oxford.
Yes, of course.
Go and see some soccer and wander around the university. And
Oxfordshire girl right here. Ryder Cup course to Banbury Cross.
Yeah. So, and that's why COVID is problematic.
Mm-hmm. But you can still get the book. and get to know Bill in the book. And we would love to hear your views whenever you read what happened. Guys, go and get it. I highly recommend it. Thank you so much, Dr. Bill, for joining us.
Great fun. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go into Joyride by Roxette.